Hi everyone, welcome to the podcast. Today we are diving deep into a topic that affects every student, teacher, and education leader as well. How to actually apply proven learning strategies in real life into your classroom, your institution, or your daily study habit. And to help us do that, I'm incredibly excited to be joined by Dr. Cynthia Nebel, a learning scientist who recently took on a job as Director of Learning Services at St. Louis Medical School to take her amazing research and findings and actually apply into real life practice. Dr. Nebel has spent many years studying how students learn best, what makes knowledge stick, and what are the strategies that lead to deep, long-lasting learning. He has taught at Vanderbilt, Westwood, and Lindenwood, worked at Fortune 500 companies, and even advised the US State Department. So she knows her stuff. But here's the catch. While there are a lot of research, studies, and findings out there about the best learning methods like active recall, spaced repetition, and retrieval practice, getting students to use it on a daily basis consistently is a whole other story. Since stepping into her role at St. Louis University, Cindy has been tackling this exact challenge. And that brings us to our topics today. What are the scientific proven best learning methods? How they work, and what are some misconceptions around them? If these methods work incredibly well, why aren't they widely adopted by students and faculty? What are the barriers and challenges here? And finally, what can educators and administrators do today to bring these methods into daily practice? So if you're a faculty member, a student, an educator, an administrator, or you just want to learn better, this episode is for you. All right, let's get into it. Hi, Cindy. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
As a space geek myself, it's really a true honor to have you as a guest. I hope we're gonna have an insightful conversation. Maybe to start things off, can you tell a bit about your current research and I'd like to ask this question: what excites you the most?
Yeah, so about a year and a half ago now, I switched roles. And so now I'm the director of learning services at a medical school. So I'm not in sort of a traditional faculty role where I have tons of opportunity to do research, but you can't keep me away. So a lot of the work I'm doing now is, it's exciting because I'm taking a lot of the theoretical stuff that I've talked about forever, the things that we've seen work so well in the laboratory. And I'm like here in person saying to a student, hey, go try this week. And then coming back to see how well it works. Right. And so it's fun and exciting to see some of the limitations of the research that exists. And I think that's going to drive things further, which to me is very exciting. But some of those limitations are things around like student motivation and student anxiety, which aren't things that we have often talked about in the research as being like at the intersection of these effective learning strategies.
Thanks so much. And how would you, like you mentioned that learning strategies itself have been proven in laboratory and not necessarily work in action or harder to put it into practice. Can you just like summarize real quick what are these learning methodologies that have been proven to be super effective?
Yeah, so when we're looking especially at spaced repetition and at retrieval practice in particular, and I might say spaced practice and retrieval practice because they're kind of used interchangeably, but when we look at these two in particular, what's really cool is there is so much research out there on these two topics. They've been so widely studied that we know that they work with lots of different kinds of materials. We know that they work with different age groups or special populations. We know that they work in the classroom and out of the classroom and even in different settings. And so, when we're talking about spaced practice, right, we're talking about this idea of spaced review of information, right? So going back over, restudying-ish, but restudying material, but spaced out over time. So kind of just the opposite of cramming, of just like rereading something over and over again. When we're talking about retrieval practice, we're talking about the idea of bringing information to mind. And that can happen in lots of different ways and at lots of different time points. What's cool is that these two things put together is even more powerful, right? So spaced retrieval practice, right? So the idea is instead of rereading notes or rereading a textbook or whatever when you're going to restudy, it is answering some questions about it or writing down everything you can remember about it and then looking up the answers maybe. But it's doing retrieval practice at each of those spaced repetition points. So the sort of difference between like laboratory and I don't even want to say classroom necessarily, because we have tons of classroom research. The difference between all of that and my world is that I'm working with students who are self-directed, right? They're trying to do this on their own out in the world. When we look at interventions like in schools where an educator is creating the spaced repetition for students, it works. The difference is making sure that students are actually doing the thing we're talking about. And even though I can say like, oh, it works in the classroom, and I do feel confident saying that, there are times where you have to be kind of careful about things, right? So I mentioned I've done a lot of online learning. And in online learning, you can assign something that is supposed to be retrieval practice, but it only works if the students actually retrieve it and don't look up the answers, right? So these are kind of some of the nuances of going from like theory to design, right?
Exactly.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And maybe just to circle back a little bit about the actual methods, can you give an example for both spaced review, spaced practice, and retrieval practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So one really effective way that educators can use spaced practice is to have some kind of spaced practice plan. I'm going to totally cheat and combine the two as I explain this. But one thing that educators can do is essentially just delay homework or delay projects about a topic. So imagine that in August, beginning of the school year, a certain topic is covered in class. Instead of just doing whatever kind of homework might be assigned for that topic in August, you wait and do the homework over that in September. So now students are required to go back over that material, right? They have to review that material in order to remember it. So they're not doing it immediately after they've learned it, right? There's a little bit of forgetting that happens. It turns out forgetting is really good for learning. So a little bit of forgetting happens, and then they have to do this homework.
Why is
it good for learning? There's a few different reasons for this. And part of it is the way that our neurons work. Okay. So when things get activated, they're activated for a little bit of time, and that's a good thing. But in order to strengthen memory, in order to hold on to things longer, you want them to be activated again. Right? So if you are reading something and immediately rereading it, it's not activated again. It's just still active, right? So those neurons haven't had a chance to like calm down before they've gotten re-excited. And part of what happens when you do that is every time we activate those neurons, we create new connections. So you're creating connections between what you've learned in the meantime, what you might be thinking about it in a different way. So you're building stronger neural networks as you do that. But that can only happen if you have a little bit of forgetting first, so that you have to then rewire those things. If you don't have that forgetting, then you're just kind of like holding on to everything and keeping it all active, and it doesn't get a chance to do that new neural wiring that leads to that strengthened memory. That makes sense?
It does, yeah. So to sum up this first section about like methodologies, spaced repetition is reviewing information over time rather just cramming a single moment. So for example, learning on day 1, day 5, day 20, and day 60, rather than cramming 2 days before the exam. And then retrieval practice is actually bringing information to mind, so answering a test rather than rereading the material. And together, spaced retrieval practice is the way to go in theory, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Amazing.
Not in theory, in reality. I'm going to say in reality, right? Like I said, in my world, it's just that I want students to go do that on their own, and there are a billion reasons why they don't. And that's why it's in theory. This should be helpful.
Yeah. So I'll ask a bit about some common criticism around these methods that I
Yeah.
hear. That I'll just love your take on those. So, for instance, the first one that I usually hear is that spaced repetition and this kind of learning and also cramming is usually best for factual information. What's your take on that? Does it apply to conceptual knowledge, or does it, how do you view this topic? I guess you heard this before.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So-
Oh yeah. No, so it does work for both factual information and conceptual information. That is true. But there are some like subtle nuances here that I think are important. So one is we do have research, and if you want, Benedict, I can send you the like a couple of links to like blog posts that I've written about some of this research if you want to include it in like show notes or something like that. So that folks can find this. But there is research showing that if you do retrieval practice, like of applied retrieval practice, right? So that is, I am asking like higher level order questions as my retrieval practice. So it's not just like flashcards. It's not just like asking very sort of rote memorization kind of questions, but I'm asking questions like, how is this related to something we learned earlier this year? Or compare and contrast these topics or something that we can see a beautiful retrieval practice effect for that material on other conceptual information. So that's a really good thing. We also can see a certain amount of retrieval practice benefit for what we call transfer, which is basically applying knowledge, right? So, how much does retrieving this information, like this very specific piece of information, help me answer related information? And it turns out that yes, it can. There's some limitations there. It's not like if I'm retrieving information about the solar system, that's going to help me understand something that is wildly different than that, right? Um, but if I'm answering questions about like one specific planet, for example, if that information is actually directly relevant for understanding another planet, then likely that retrieval practice is going to help on the other type of question, right?
Yeah.
So there is some transfer that can occur. It's just somewhat near transfer that the stuff you're retrieving has to be directly relevant to whatever you're trying to transfer to.
So it's
Um, yeah, go ahead.
can we usually how I answer this question when I get this asked and
You're like,
is that
let me tell you what you should say.
yeah. No, like no, I actually like this is exactly like kind of how I viewed this topic. Uh, Apart from the whole like transfer knowledge, which I didn't read a lot of studies yet, but it's super exciting. But I'm just asking, like, do you think it's a valid way to put it? Like, to know information, even if it's factual, even if it's small amount, you need information in order to conceptually or critically think. You are not
Yeah, that
able,
was
like,
the
when.
next thing I was going to say. Yes, yes.
So,
So,
so
yeah, no, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. So, retrieving factual information and having that stuff more readily available to you, we know that doing that kind of retrieval practice both makes it much quicker and easier to access that information, but it also reorganizes that information so you can hold more in mind at any given time, which then leads to better critical and creative thinking about that information, right? You have to have the information in order to problem solve about it.
yeah,
Yes.
how would you answer or reply to those claims that in today's world, when you can look up anything, you don't need factual information?
Yeah. So I turned to some really interesting research. I'm just going to give you one example here. This is a famous study called the chess study. And in this particular research, right, what they did was they took novices and like chess masters. Now, I'm a complete novice when we're talking about chess. Everything I know came from that Netflix show. And yeah, right. I know nothing. So to me, I'm looking at a chessboard and I'm seeing like horsey, castle. I don't know what these things are. Um, and they gave them a board and had them try to memorize the board, right? And when you look at novices, they can remember, like five pieces. And that makes sense because that's like the median for working memory is like that's how much you can hold on to for a little bit of time. When you look at masters, though, they give them a board, same amount of time to look at it. They can recreate 16 pieces on that board in the same amount of time. Well, what's happening here is that they are seeing patterns, right? There's pattern recognition happening there where they're like, yes, that's the Queen's Gambit or whatever, right? Instead of seeing individual pieces. Well, the same thing happens with all of our knowledge, right? As we develop expertise, there's another example, another good study. So if we go away from chess, let's talk about baseball. There's a study called the baseball study, colloquially. And in this study, it's for kids, and they did a reading comprehension test for kids. And it was about baseball. It's another great example because I also know nothing about baseball. So imagine I'm reading a sentence, and in that sentence, they say something about a double play. For me, I'm stopping and I'm going, 2. Okay, I know it has something to do with 2. 2 outs, 2 runs, 2, what else could it be? 2 hits. I have no idea. 2 strikes. I don't know what a double play is. And so I'm going to have to slow down, think about that. Shoot, based on what you just said, I might have to Google it, right? Because I don't know what that is. And so it's going to take me a lot longer to process that sentence. And I'm probably going to take less away from this entire passage because I don't have the background knowledge to really absorb it, right? Yeah. So while yes, it's true that we could Google everything, for me, I'm going to have like these little bits of information, right? My little pieces on a chessboard. I'm only going to be able to hold 5 of them. Those chess masters are going to see much bigger pieces of information so they can process it qualitatively differently and better than a novice can, right? Because they're going to be able to hold on to a lot more in order to come up with a better creative problem to solve or something, right? Solution to a problem, than someone who can only hold on to a couple little bits. So if we have to Google everything, we only ever have bits and we don't have the whole picture.
Exactly. Yeah. Totally agree. And so, or one of the big ways you can actually see this in action in real life is when you listen to I would say any kind of podcast or any kind of panel, and especially let's say politics, where there are some political scientists who are bringing information from 300 years ago, that there was an analogy in the history, or there was this GDP increase there and there, and they are thinking with all that information. And even if I could critically think like crazy, if I don't have the information, I'm not able to put these pieces together when I'm actually have to think about what's happening right now. So amazing. One more question about space repetition, especially kind of like criticism again, is there are a lot of learning science around types of learners. For example, auditory, visual, and from your reaction, I have the same reaction. There are like
I don't know if video's being recorded here, but like I just rolled my eyes.
Yeah. So does space repetition only when people say it's not for me, it doesn't work for me, does the science actually back up that it's not for you? It's just a niche of people that are actually using it effectively, or it's a misconception, it's actually working for everyone, or for the abundance of people?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here. So the first answer is about learning styles, but I'm actually going to argue like there could be a little bit of truth to what this claim is making, but a little bit, and not based in learning styles, right? So this learning styles hypothesis that individuals have these different learning preferences, sure, everybody's got preferences. I would prefer to work in a coffee shop than prefer in my office. I'm a coffee worker or something like right? So we have these different preferences about learning. What is true, though, is that lots of people now have attempted to say, okay, if you prefer auditory information, we should be able to show that you learn best that way, and you don't. So no one can find that interaction that says like, oh, so we should give material in that style. That's not true.
So
More
there's
often,
preference, but
yeah, go
it's
ahead.
not more, it's, you might prefer it, but it's not going to be more effective for you, even though if you prefer it.
Right, right.
And can you link that? Sorry for jumping in that, but can you
No,
link
you're
that to
good.
the actual phenomenon, which first I read in a podcast that recently Andrew Huberman did a whole podcast about this, is hard learning, or challenging learning is actually better for you, and therefore your preference of learning visual styles might actually be counterproductive to your final learning.
Yeah, but this is where we get into this like motivational thing too, right?
Mm,
Because you're 100% correct that it's this thing called desirable difficulties that Bjork talks about. But yeah, it's effortful learning is better, right? If it's easy, lazy thinking is going to lead to lazy learning, right? You're just not going to get as much out of it. But if you're really having to sort of mentally wrestle with material, that sticks longer. Okay.
yeah,
So you might be right. I can't say that we definitively have the research to say there's a crossover effect here, right? To say that like if you prefer auditory, you'll actually do better with visual. What seems to be more true is that materials need to match learning modality, right?
yeah,
Like I can't imagine a surgeon learning how to suture auditorily. Like that needs
yeah,
to be kinesthetic, right? Like
makes
obviously
sense.
that needs to be kinesthetic. But that tends to be true when we look at even like K through 12 education, and we're saying like how should we teach reading? How should we teach about the solar system or whatever it is that I can't imagine my kids trying to understand the solar system without some visual component, right?
Yeah,
It wouldn't make as much sense. So matching the material to the learning modality is usually better, and multiple modalities is usually better. We know that also. Multiple modalities is good. But if we get back to this idea of student motivation, this is where I think this might actually matter a little bit, right? Because if I have a preference for auditory information, I might not persist as long in my study, those kinds of things, which means that this could matter, but not matter for the sort of like theoretical reasons people
yeah,
argue that it does. Does that
makes
make sense?
sense. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
definitely. And so to sum this one up, there are preferences, but not necessarily types of learners that actually benefit better from each
That's right.
individual modality. You should, or motivation can have effects on modality, and the final thing is like mixing modalities is actually better. There's science behind it. How would you use spaced repetition? Because I think there is a big difference between spaced practice, because spaced practice could be done with any modality.
That's
The
right.
question is, does spaced practice require a type of learner, a type of person to benefit, or it's for everyone?
It works for everyone. I feel like I can say
Yeah.
that so definitively. The one thing that we there is some nice research out there about retrieval practice in particular is one that's coming to mind. It might be true for space practice too. Often these two things go together anyway, but
Yeah.
that individuals who have lower working memory capacities actually benefit more from these strategies. So
Mm.
even though the strategies might be a little bit more challenging, what's happening is just as we talked about when we can organize things and have them in bigger chunks. If you can only hold 2 bits of information or 3 bits of information, if you can make those bits bigger, you're going to benefit even more from this than someone who can hold tons of information in mind. Um, and similarly, if we can make things come to mind really fast, which is what spaced repetition is and retrieval practice are both really good for, is also that efficiency. If we can get things to come to mind really fast, then you don't take up as much of your working memory resources with that like super effortful retrieval because it's happening a lot quicker. So people who have more struggles with working memory tend to benefit more. So that's the only like learner difference that I know of off the top of my head
Mm.
for who would benefit more or less from these.
So if I'm getting it correct, does it mean that there's actually, or there might be a negative correlation between, very simply put, better memory and effectiveness of spaced repetition? So if you have a kind of worse memory, spaced repetition or spaced retrieval practice can have a better effect on your outcomes.
Yeah, that's right.
That's super interesting for me because the thing is that what I see on the other hand is that like a higher achieving student, let's say better memory, but higher achieving students tend to use these methods much, much more frequently than students who are lower achieving and who are mid achieving.
Yep. Yep. This is the main frustration of my job, right here.
Yeah.
But we've got a chicken and the egg problem. Are these high achieving students high achieving because they're using the right strategies already, right? Is that the causal mechanism here, or are these easier for them so they're more likely to do it, right? So I mean, the why is really kind of an interesting thing here because as we just said, it is more difficult than the alternative, right? Spacing out is more difficult than cramming. Retrieving is more difficult than rereading.
Is
it
it more difficult, or is it more difficult, or is it less intuitive? Because when you think about the whole thing, and how, like, when you think about like the whole, because there are a lot of thoughts around that, is that it's actually, when you think about, compare the two in terms of like actual effort put in, space repetition still comes up as leader. So it's not just necessarily like better for long-term retention, but even if you space out your review sessions and instead of cramming, you will do less at the end for the same result. So
yes,
in that case, it's even less difficult. It's just not intuitive to space out your reviews rather than making it really short before exam. Is that right?
Yeah, I would argue that it doesn't feel good. Maybe
that's
what I mean
good.
by difficulty.
It does
right?
not feel good,
actually.
Not
necessarily like about like literal effort. It's what feels good. And so if you're rereading the same thing over and over again, it feels like you're learning, right? It's getting more fluent. You're reading faster. You're comprehending quicker. And that all is true in that moment. And then you're going to have a really quick fall off of that information. But it feels really good. If you let a little forgetting happen and then you come back and read it again and now you're confused, that doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
But it's what's better for learning. So I think we're saying the same thing just in two different ways. That it's like non-intuitive, but it's because it feels bad.
Yeah. There's also a study where they I actually see the study as well. This is one of the most interesting ones for me. When they had 4 groups of students, each had to learn one thing. In the end, what happened is that once the group read the material once, second group read the material 4 times, third group read the material, did the mind map. I already see your face that you're familiar with this. And the fourth group read the material once and then did retrieval practice. And there were like 3 main assessments, and the first 2 were conceptual and factual. Basically, both of them retrieval practice outperformed every other by far. And the third one, which is I think the most interesting one, is that metacognitive predictions, meaning how do you view your knowledge, were actually lower than all the others in retrieval practice. So how do you see that paradox between how effective it is and how you view your own knowledge based on that?
Yeah, this is the struggle, right? This is the struggle for me in my job, right? Because it is so. What we tend to find is that folks who are doing the less effective strategy, the rereading, the cramming, those kinds of things, tend to be overconfident, like usually way overconfident in these studies, which isn't good, right? Like you don't want folks to be overconfident. Those are the students that are going to come to you and say, I don't understand. I knew everything before I walked into that test. I don't know what happened, right? And it's because they were doing something that led to that overconfidence. They weren't in tune with it. Retrieval practice in a lot of studies leads to better metacognitive awareness. So usually people are closer to accurate, but a little bit underconfident. Yes. But they're usually closer to accurate. In my mind, as an educator, I think this is a good thing because that's going to lead to more persistence and maybe longer studying and higher motivation. Even as a student, I feel like I would rather have a much better sense of where I am before I walk in and take that test than be like, I don't know how much I know. I have no idea how I'm going to perform on this, right? But if I've already tested myself when I walk in the door, I have a good sense of what that's going to be. But then we get into these motivational issues.
So So even when if you compare two students, one of them is cramming and the other one is doing spaced repetition, the spaced repetition student will, with the same amount of knowledge, the cramming student will feel a higher, no, like feel that he knows the information better, and the spaced repetition student will think he knows the information worse. Therefore, it's still, there is even another difference, which is like the student who is doing spaced repetition will do more because he doesn't feel he's there yet.
Right.
Correct?
Right.
Amazing. So yeah, let's get into the problems. I
Yeah.
think we cover space repetition and retrieval practice really well. What I see is that as a medical student myself, or as an ex-medical student myself, I did a lot of space repetition after I failed a bit in medical school. I wasn't the best. I started using space repetition. I became one of the best students in the university, and then I checked like who else is using it. And I'm from Hungary, and Anki and space repetition is not as well um, used as it might be in medical schools in the US, but still, the thing I see is that only the top achievers are the ones who are actually. I'm not saying they are the ones who are using it only, but they are the ones who are using it as it's supposed to be used. So not like in a way of, I use it for one class, or I actually use it for as it's supposed to be. What do you think about, how do you view that?
It's so hard because there's a whole lot of correlations happening here, and we don't know what the causal mechanism is. And to be very frank, I know of no research study that has actually looked into this. It would be really difficult to do anyway, because we can't like experimentally assign people to, you don't get to use the resource and you do, like that. They don't like us to do that.
Yeah.
But like I said before, I think that it's possible that the high achieving students get that way because they're using these things, right? But one of the issues that we see here sometimes is that, these things take time, right? So doing Anki, so Anki is a flashcard system that builds in an algorithm for spaced repetition. Doing Anki it takes time, it takes effort. And so if we have students who are low performing students for whatever reason, and they are already struggling to do well in their classes, asking them on top of that to also do Anki over the course of the curriculum so that they're holding on to that long term, which is what Anki is designed for, really, it becomes a time management issue of like, okay, we can't sacrifice your current class for this long-term retention, right? We can't do that. So there's a little bit of that. There might be some intersection with some of the working memory stuff that I was talking about, where the high achieving students can go through Anki super fast.
Yeah.
And then the lower achieving students, it takes them a little bit more time because it's a little bit more effortful for them to retain this material. And so they might just not have the sort of the same capacity to do that.
Yeah.
All things being equal, I think that if we could get everyone to do it the right way, it would benefit everyone. But the way that the system is designed limits how much time people have and how much energy they can, there's always picking and choosing where to put energy. And so it becomes problematic. So I don't have the definitive answer. This is just kind of what I've seen.
Yeah. The same thing, like I've talked with colleague of yours in wide terms, in terms of like space repetition colleague. And what she said is that she does not think that the reason is lack of education about these methods, because this was, I think, quite popular opinion a couple of years, like maybe 5-10 years back, when there was actually there was a lot of research, but not a lot of like trend around space repetition. But I think this has changed in the last 5 years, when there is like a ton and ton of resources out there. There are a ton of tools out there, literally hundreds of flashcard apps that have space repetition in it. And what I've seen is that it still didn't make a whole amount of difference. There might be a bit more students using it, but I don't see it like completely widespread across institutions. So what I interpret from that is that there has to be a different factor in there, which is not lack of tools or lack of education about these methods. It's either, as you said, motivation or some other factor that comes into play. And you mentioned anxiety in the beginning of our chat.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate more on how the anxiety happens with space repetition or these tools?
Yeah, so all of these things, right, are operating on working memory, all of these things. And so one of the big things we see with anxiety is that it anxiety takes up space in working memory. So we have some decent research now that
Yes.
shows that when we are anxious, it doesn't even have to be like conscious ruminating, although certainly that makes things worse. Like if you are in your head constantly like spiraling and saying, I'm so worried I'm going to fail or whatever, that's happening in your working memory, which reduces the amount of working memory space that you have for these desirable difficulties, for these effortful things we're asking students to do. Um, so that's kind of what's happening. So if we can, there are some strategies that can be used to offload anxiety prior to learning. That can be a very useful thing. And then otherwise, sometimes it's like just coping mechanisms and things so that folks aren't experiencing that extreme level of anxiety, or that we can get them out of that like spiral and rumination space quickly so that they can get back to that focus. But it really all is operating on working memory and how much attentional resource and processing space you have
Yeah.
to focus on something. But that's how it intersects with these strategies, is that it's hard to do complex retrieval practice of, to process a diagnostic case, right? Like one of these questions, it's like a big word problem. It's really hard to process that if you're not firing on all cylinders, if half of your brain is taken
Yeah.
up with anxiety.
Yeah, and also I do think that one of the factors in this place, this when we talked in the beginning or a couple of thoughts back, is about intuition. Like it just not as a student, it's not intuitive to imagine you are in week 5 of the semester and you have your final exam in 8 weeks, and I know that I'm not gonna like at week 5, I wouldn't study week 1 material, but I know that I have 8 weeks to do a final exam. So it's just not intuitive as a student on a given day to do these methods.
Yeah, you're right. When we look at motivation research and like research on procrastination and these things, like the folks are concerned about, the thing that's on fire right now, which is I have an exam in 2 days. I'm prepping for that. I'm not thinking about doing spaced repetition for old material. And that anxiety is, of course, going to increase that, right? That the more
Yeah,
anxiety you have, the more you're going to focus in on just the very next thing. Yeah.
yeah, definitely. Okay, then maybe moving on to my final topic, which I think is the most important one, is how do you view, because currently there is, we agree that there is not a wide adoption of these methods from students. There might be bigger in medical schools, but especially like in non-medical schools, not that big. What kind of opportunities do you see when actually integrating these methods into students' life, either from like a student first level or an institutional level?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that this is critical. I mean,
This is the
I
million
don't
dollar
know how to.
question.
Right. Yeah. I mean, but it's so critical that we think about this from an institutional level, from a cultural level, that we
Yeah,
really, in order for this to make an impact on education systems, we need to be thinking about this at a systemic level. Like, and even an individual educator trying to do this in their classroom, yes, they might make a difference in that student's life, but in order to really make long lasting impact, this needs to be bigger than that. It needs to be
yeah.
institutional cultural change. Um, but to answer like the what can we do, what should we do part of
Can
things.
I actually do
Yeah,
a follow-up on what you just said? Um,
absolutely.
I want to do like a distinction between, because spaced review, spaced practice can happen in a lot of different amount of content, and I will be exact here. So Anki and the flashcard tools are usually working on a single piece or just a couple of pieces of information at a time.
Yep.
Space practice, as I've seen in programs, in like the medical program, for example, can happen in a course style as well. So, for example, ECG is something that you, or especially when I was in medical school, is something that you learn in your first weeks of medical school. You learn in your second year, your third year, fourth year as well. Is that is that also how to space practice, or which is there a preference, and is one or the other better, which is an information or pieces of information based space practice, or a whole lot of content based space practice? Hope it makes sense, my question.
It does. I mean, I think it depends on the end goal. I think that in reality, it depends on the end goal. If you wanted individuals to remember, the fine grained, detailed information, then these sort of like flashcard methods really are the best way to do that, right? But often that's not what we want. Often we want some larger conceptual understanding of something, or how to apply it in some new situation. And in the K through 12 arena, so I think you're right that is one thing medical schools do well. Even though it is rapid fire, it's like the fire hose method of getting information in. There's so much, but that information gets repeated strategically. It gets repeated. So now you know the foundations. Now we're going to do it for pathology, for like when things go wrong. And now we're going to repeat it for the clinical setting. And now we're going to, right? So you get to see it in lots of different situations. In K through 12 education, this is often called like a spiral or a strand curriculum. Yeah. It's this idea that you're going to see that material again and again, but with other surrounding information. And the places I've seen that have done this particularly well, it has to be like at least the entire department having a conversation about what are the most important things that we make sure come up time and again in this curriculum, right? Not in this class. Yes, there might be things that you want to space out in a class, but also on the broader scale within the curriculum. Even on a bigger scale, I've seen this happen at an entire school, right? That they say like, these are principles that cut across disciplines, and we want to make sure that they come up in these different places. So we're going to make sure that we do that. But it has to be a big conversation. You have to have buy-in from everyone involved in order to make that happen, which often means that there has to be administrative push to make that happen, right? Like the top person has to say, this is my priority. And so we're going to do this, right? And then it happens. Yeah.
And how do you view, because I rather think of this as not something an either or, like course level space repetition, which would require pieces of information, and program level space repetition of space practice, where you would revisit content for all. So when you only do it in a course, let's say, which is probably the easiest way to target this first, because you don't have to recreate the whole program. Do you see a better long-term knowledge for students who have done in that course, as a 13-week course, space practice, rather than one-time cramming, if they don't do a lot of space practice often? Like if I want to put it this way, you learn on day 1, day 3, day 5, day 50, day 150, and that's it. You don't do the next review, which is day 300 or something. Do you see a better long-term knowledge for those who just done space repetition for a course?
Absolutely, right? So I can very definitively say we have the research now to support that any amount of space repetition is better than none, right? Any space repetition is better than none. But essentially what you do is, if you know kind of what the forgetting curve looks like, that it's a very sharp decrease at the beginning, and then it becomes shallower over time. What spaced repetition does is kind of like reduces the curve on that, right? So forgetting is still going to happen. Forgetting is always still going to happen, but you're making it happen slower by doing that spaced repetition.
You flatten it out.
So even if you could only do it within a course, you're reducing the speed at which that information disappears after that course.
Yeah. Amazing. So how do you what are some success stories that you've seen in classroom or in programs that have done this successfully?
Yeah. So a couple that I'll name off here. So one is an educator who was working, I think this was at a community college. But what they did in their course was introduced daily, every class they had with students, it started with a cumulative quiz. And at the beginning, students hated this. Of course, students hated this at the beginning. But by the time they got to exams, they felt so good walking into like the actual course exams that were these high stakes situations because they'd been doing this all semester long. The actual like quiz that they had at the beginning of class was for points, but was like 1 point or something, right? It was a very, very low stakes situation. So enough that students still tried to prep for it. They like tried to go over the things that they were concerned about. But that particular educator saw huge gains, huge gains in their courses, in that course, by the end of the semester, where they had the same final exam prior to doing this and after doing this. And like the difference is massive. So like fairly easy thing to do, right? Like you're not upending the entire course. You're just adding like a 5-minute quiz at the beginning of each class that is cumulative. So you're making sure you always get that spaced repetition in. But wasn't just I mean, to me, that's like, just do that thing. That's easy. Like, just do that, right?
Yeah.
So that's one. I saw a program look at, so I taught psychology for many, many years. And there was a program that I was aware of that they did this like program level sitting down and saying, what are the concepts here? Like not the individual bits of information that are coming out of each of these courses, but what is like the bigger picture things? And it's things like the idea that all human behavior has both biological and like psychological influences on behavior, right? Like that we've got these multiple influences on behavior. And so they went through their courses and said, let's make sure that is something that is explicitly covered across courses so that students are getting that repeated through the curriculum so that then when they graduate, that is hopefully a concept that sticks with them. So I saw that as like a very successful way of thinking about doing this.
Yeah, it's really good because that's also like one course level or like information level
Right.
space practice, and the other one is like a program topic and chapter and content level space practice.
Right.
Super interesting.
It's interesting that when we go down to like the elementary level, this is already happening. It's at some point in time we forget and we stop doing this. But you know, when I think about my own children, when they were, you know, real little, like 2 years old, how do you get kids to learn their colors or whatever? You constantly do spaced retrieval practice, right? You point at things and you say, what color is this? You don't like math it, like, oh, we're just going to learn blue today and never talk about it again, right?
Yeah,
We do this
such a
so
great analogy.
naturally, right? We do this so naturally with little kids, and sometime along the way, we just like stop doing it. We think that, oh, we'll just tell them and it'll stick forever.
So let me summarize things up. We do agree, and there is a lot of research out there that these methods work. We do agree, and there's a lot of information out there that these methods are not widely spread in K-12 and higher ed. And there are success stories out there. What do you think can bring the change? And I'm being specific here. Do you think this revolution of AI can actually bring a change in adaptation of these methods? Because now I'm going to talk about something that has been around for 300 years and been proven to be super effective and has not been widely adopted. So do you think AI can bring a change in this aspect? And if yes, how?
I think AI has huge potential for good and bad. I think AI has the potential to have students stop thinking as much as we would like them to get rid of some of the desirable difficulties on the bad side. At the same time, on the positive side, yeah, you could have, you know, through like machine learning kind of things, like have algorithms that are so much better for students that learn and adapt to where they are and exactly what they need. You could, as an educator, use AI to plan out lessons so that you make sure that you have spaced repetition of material, and AI will just plan it all. It'll create the calendar for you so that you make sure you cover things in a way that you get to cover them again. It can create beautiful like homework assignments for you that are cumulative in nature. It can grade students' assignments for you, right? It has the potential to do so much. The limitation is our creativity and imagination, I think. And making sure that we're using it appropriately, right?
Yeah.
So I have a friend of mine who says, just because we can doesn't mean we should, right? So just because like AI exists and just because students are going to use it anyway, doesn't mean you have to adopt it in your classroom. So I think that the critical piece here is always to stop and think, what is my end goal? What do I want students to be able to do? And am I making sure they're getting practice doing that now? Right. So if I want them to be able to retrieve this information later on, I need to make sure they're practicing doing that now. But if I want them to be able to critically think about material, I need to make sure that they're practicing doing that and not letting AI do it for them. Yeah.
Give your best recommendations to dig deeper.
All right.
As an educator or an administrator who wants probably put this into practice in their school.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are tons of great resources out there. I'm going to do the shameless plug for my website. Our website is learningscientists.org. And so it's plural, learningscientists.org. And on there, we just have a ton of free resources for educators. It's a labor of love. We do these things just because we want to get this information into the hands of educators. So if you go to the blog archive and you click on space practice, you'll get all the articles that have ever been written. And it'll include things that we have written about the research, but also things educators have written about using it in their classroom. So you get some concrete examples of how you can use this. So that's one good resource. I'll also put in a couple other plugs. We also have a couple books that people are welcome to read. There's one specifically for educators called Understanding How We Learn. Again, I'm not even an author on it, so I get nothing to tell you guys, but it's a good one. It's a good one. But I'm also going to put in a plug for retrievalpractice.org. So that's a very, very good friend of mine who runs that website. And while it is primarily about retrieval practice, there are some resource guides in there that cover, I mean, all the things we've talked about today: metacognition, transfer, space practice, lots and lots of good stuff on there that kind of summarizes a lot of that research in a really, really straightforward way. And she has a book as well that is on that website too. You mentioned to me that you've read Make It Stick. That's it's like the classic in this area. Yeah. Even though it's a little bit older at this point, I think that it has really kind of stood the test of time. So that's a really
easy
good
read,
one.
though.
Really easy read. A lot of written by my PhD advisor, and actually, retrievalpractice.org. The other author is her PhD advisor. So,
that's amazing.
So, I mean, those would be my quickest probably recommendations. On our website, we also have like a whole list of other resources that have books and stuff that others have written that we try to share the love as much as we can.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Cindy, for coming on the podcast. And I think we covered a really good space repetition overview and practical application. So thank you so much again.
You are so welcome. This is fun.
Thank you.